The wind howls through the barren landscape, a cruel and biting force, carrying with it the scent of snow and ice. It sweeps across the frozen plains, where the sun barely rises above the horizon, casting only a faint, pale light on the land below. The air is sharp, frigid, a constant reminder of the world's harsh embrace. Snowflakes drift lazily in the sky, but they do not fall softly. They crash against the earth with the force of 1,000 tiny hammers, relentless in their mission to blanket the ground in icy white. The land is alive with the sting of winter, and there is no escape. This is the world of the Vikings. Stretching across Scandinavia, from the towering peaks of Norway to the icy expanses of Sweden and Denmark, this was a place where the elements seemed to conspire against the people who called it home. Winter, the longest and most challenging season, stretched on for what felt like forever. The darkness could last for months, and the daylight hours were brief and fleeting, leaving the people in a seemingly unending night. It is said that the Vikings lived in a land of ice and fire, where their resilience was tested not by the conflicts of men but by the fierce, untamable forces of nature. Here, in the rugged and unforgiving terrain, life was a battle, a daily struggle to survive the brutal cold that would freeze anyone who was unprepared. Yet, in this land of extremes, the Vikings thrived. They were not just survivors but masters of adaptation, shaping their world to their will in ways that still astonish us today. To live in such a place required more than just courage. It demanded a deep understanding of the land, the seasons, and the ever-changing rhythm of the earth. The Vikings knew that to endure the coldest winters, they needed to be clever, to harness nature's power in ways no one could have imagined. They learned how to bend the brutal winter to their advantage, a feat that was nothing short of miraculous, given the environment they inhabited. Imagine, for a moment, being a Viking in this landscape. The biting cold of the northern winds cuts through your clothes, seeping into your bones. The ground beneath your feet is frozen solid, as if it has become a part of the endless ice. The sky is dark, thick clouds hanging low, blocking out the sun for days on end. Snow crunches underfoot, and every breath you take is a sharp stab in your lungs. The cold is all-consuming. It's not a mere inconvenience but a constant, ever-present enemy. Yet, despite this oppressive winter, life carries on. Villages are built, families are raised, and battles are fought, both with each other and with the environment itself. The Vikings were accustomed to this struggle. They had learned not just to survive but to find ways to thrive in this frigid, frozen world. As you stand in this Viking world, it becomes clear that warmth, the kind of warmth that could protect you from the cold and give you the strength to endure, was no small matter. It was a lifeline, a vital force that made the difference between life and death. The world they inhabited was not merely cold, but also treacherous. The temperatures would dip far below freezing, and the wind would howl at such speeds that it would strip away anything that wasn't secured. The cold was not just a discomfort, it was a killer. But even as the land seemed to conspire against them, the Vikings found ways to keep warm. Their survival depended on it, and their ingenuity knew no bounds. They understood the elements, the snow, the ice, the wind, as no one else could. The knowledge of how to adapt to such a brutal environment was passed down through generations, and it became deeply ingrained in their way of life. At the same time, they didn't just endure the cold, they learned to embrace it, to work with it. The harsh winters became part of their identity. The long, dark nights were not seen as periods of despair, but rather times for storytelling, for strengthening bonds, and for reinforcing the Viking spirit. Life in this extreme environment was a lesson in resilience. It shaped who they were and how they saw the world. They came to understand that they were not simply living through the cold. They were learning how to use it, to thrive in it, to find warmth in the most unlikely places. And yet, in a place where the cold seems endless, there was also warmth, both literal and metaphorical. The hearths in their homes would burn brightly, the flickering flames offering comfort and light against the overwhelming darkness of the night. The warmth of the fire was a beacon, drawing people together in the center of their longhouses, where families and clans would gather to share stories, exchange news, and celebrate life in spite of the harshness of the world outside. These moments, however simple, became the heart of Viking society. In the face of such extreme cold, the warmth of the hearth became a symbol of hope, of life, and of perseverance. But warmth wasn't something that could be taken for granted. It had to be earned, cultivated, and fiercely protected. The Vikings knew that their survival depended on their ability to find, create, and maintain warmth. The cold wasn't something that could simply be wished away. It was a constant, relentless presence that had to be fought. And yet, despite this, there was something almost poetic in the way the Vikings approached the challenge. They didn't see the cold as an enemy to be conquered. Instead, they saw it as a force to be understood, respected, and used to their advantage. It was an intricate dance between man and nature, one where survival wasn't guaranteed but was always within reach, so long as the right choices were made. The question that hangs in the air now, as we journey deeper into the world of the Vikings, is how? How did these people, living in such extreme conditions, manage to keep warm when the world around them seemed intent on freezing them? What secrets did they unlock that allowed them not only to survive but to thrive during the coldest winters? It is a mystery that has captivated historians and storytellers alike for centuries. And as we delve into the heart of this story, we will uncover the surprising and ingenious ways in which the Vikings kept warm in the face of winter's relentless assault. For in this frozen world, warmth was not just a necessity. It was a triumph. The Viking world was a realm dominated by extremes. It was a land where nature did not merely provide the backdrop for life but defined it, shaped it, and determined whether one would thrive or perish. To imagine the world in which the Vikings lived is to envision a place where the cold was more than just a season. It was a constant, all-encompassing presence, wrapping its icy fingers around the very soul of the land. This was a world where the winter months could stretch on seemingly forever, and even the brave would tremble in its grip. But to the Vikings, this environment was not a punishment. It was the world they knew, and it was where they learned to endure, adapt, and even flourish. The geography of Scandinavia set the stage for the Viking experience. It was a land carved by ice and shaped by time. Jagged mountains rose sharply from the ground, their snow-capped peaks piercing the sky. Between these towering cliffs lay deep fjords, their waters freezing over during the harshest parts of winter, trapping the sea beneath a thick layer of ice. The forests, dense and impenetrable, stood tall and silent, their trees heavy with snow. The ground beneath was frozen solid for months, making farming and movement a constant struggle. The Vikings did not have the luxury of easy access to resources. What they had was determination, the will to turn this unforgiving landscape into a place of possibility. In the winter, the daylight hours shrank drastically. In the far northern reaches of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, the sun barely rose above the horizon, casting a pale, fleeting light that did little to warm the land. There were days when the sky remained a brooding shade of gray, and the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly. For much of the year, the Vikings lived in a world dominated by twilight, where time itself seemed to bend and blur. The air was thick with the cold, and every breath taken outside could freeze in an instant. It was a world of shadows, silence, and the endless, oppressive weight of winter. In such a harsh environment, life could be brutal. Every aspect of Viking life was dictated by the seasons, with winter being the most formidable of them all. Survival during the cold months required an understanding of the land and a mastery over nature that was far beyond what many people living in more temperate climates could even comprehend. The Vikings didn't simply survive the winters, they embraced them. They adapted their way of life to withstand the freezing cold, and they became experts in harnessing whatever resources they could find in this frozen land. The cold wasn't their only enemy. The winds, often violent and unpredictable, could cut through the thickest clothing and sweep away everything in their path. In the mountains, the winds howled with such fury that they could strip trees of their leaves and send entire flocks of birds into panic. The relentless gusts would drive snow into swirling, blinding storms that could disorient travelers and force entire villages to huddle in place, waiting for the storm to pass. The wind, like the cold, was an ever-present force that the Vikings had no choice but to reckon with. But in the midst of all this harshness, the Vikings found a way to build their homes, to create families, to form communities. In villages and small settlements scattered across Scandinavia, the Vikings built longhouses that would serve as their refuge from the relentless cold. These longhouses were designed with the weather in mind. They were sturdy, with thick walls of wood and stone to protect against the winds. The roofs were steeply pitched to allow the snow to slide off easily, and the interiors were arranged around a central hearth, where fire would provide much-needed warmth and light. These longhouses became the heart of Viking life, a place where families and clans would gather, sharing stories, food, and warmth as the world outside froze over. Despite the seeming isolation of the Viking world, there was a deep connection to the land. The people of Scandinavia had a profound respect for nature, not in the romanticized sense we often hear about today, but in a very practical, survival-driven way. They knew that the land was both a provider and a taker, capable of giving them food, shelter, and materials to live, but also capable of destroying them with a single storm or a particularly harsh winter. The Vikings saw themselves as part of a delicate balance with the earth. They did not seek to dominate nature, but to understand and work with it. This was their strength. Hunting and fishing were vital components of Viking survival. While the winter months made fishing in the icy waters difficult, the Vikings would rely on their skill in trapping and hunting to provide for their families. They hunted a variety of animals, from deer and elk to smaller game like rabbits and birds. In the colder months, the hunting would become more difficult, but the Vikings were resourceful. They knew how to track animals through the snow and how to adapt to the seasonal changes in the landscape. They knew where the game would be during the winter and how to build snares and traps that could capture the animals despite the freezing conditions. It wasn't just about getting food, it was about survival in the most primal sense. The Vikings also made use of the resources around them. From the forests, they obtained timber for building. From the rivers, they gathered fish and other aquatic resources, and from the animals, they harvested skins and furs to make clothing and blankets. This raw, untamed land provided what they needed, but only if they knew how to use it properly. Nothing was wasted in the Viking world. Every part of the animal, every piece of wood, every grain of earth was valuable. To survive, the Vikings had to make the most of what nature provided, and they did so with incredible efficiency and ingenuity. Life in this frozen land also had a spiritual component. The Vikings believed that the forces of nature, the cold, the wind, the ice, the earth, were all part of a larger cosmic order. They didn't simply live in a world of natural phenomena. They saw these forces as living, breathing entities, each with its own will and power. They believed that the gods themselves, from the thunderous Odin to the fiery Freya, watched over them, guiding their actions and protecting them from the worst that nature had to offer. It was this deep spiritual connection to the land that allowed the Vikings to endure. The cold was not just a physical challenge but a test of their strength, will, and faith. Yet, even in the midst of this unforgiving world, there was a beauty in the simplicity of Viking life. The winter may have been harsh, but it also brought moments of stillness and peace. The vast, snow-covered landscapes could be stunning in their quiet serenity, and the long, dark nights were a time for reflection, storytelling, and bonding. The light of the fire, the warmth of the hearth, and the company of loved ones created a sense of comfort and solace amidst the storm. It was in these moments of stillness that the Vikings found their resilience. They knew that they could survive the cold, not because they were immune to it, but because they had learned to live alongside it, to respect it, and to thrive in spite of it. As we continue this journey through the Viking world, we will uncover more of how they not only adapted to this cold, dark, and unforgiving land but also how they became masters of survival in it. The challenges they faced were immense, but their ability to overcome them with ingenuity, perseverance, and a deep connection to nature is what makes their story so compelling. This is a world where the cold was not just a backdrop, but a force that shaped every aspect of their lives, from the clothes they wore to the homes they built, and ultimately to their survival against the harshest winters imaginable. The Vikings were a people born from necessity, shaped by the fierce forces of nature and the challenges of survival in a land that demanded constant ingenuity. Their world was a crucible, where only the strongest and most resourceful could thrive. It wasn't just physical strength or bravery that determined who survived and who perished, It was the ability to innovate, to adapt, and to use the land's harshest elements to one's advantage. The Vikings learned to work with nature, not against it, and their resilience became their most defining trait. In this unforgiving environment, they understood that survival was not simply about enduring, it was about mastering the world around them. The Vikings were masters of adaptation. They didn't wait for the seasons to change or for nature to give them the warmth or resources they needed. Instead, they made the land work for them, bending it to their will through creativity and invention. From their ships, which allowed them to travel vast distances across turbulent seas, to their longhouses, which provided refuge in the coldest winters, every aspect of Viking life was a product of innovation. They used the limited resources at their disposal to their greatest potential, never wasting anything and always seeking new ways to overcome obstacles. At the heart of their ingenuity was a profound respect for the materials of the land. Timber, stone, animal hides, and the earth itself were transformed through skill and knowledge into tools and shelter. The Viking longship, perhaps the most iconic symbol of their ingenuity, is a perfect example of this. These ships were not simply vessels of transportation, they were marvels of engineering, designed to endure the harsh conditions of the seas and to navigate the icy waters of the north. The longship's shallow draft allowed it to travel along coastlines, up rivers, and even land on beaches with ease. This was a ship built for speed, agility, and endurance, qualities that the Vikings needed for both exploration and raiding. But the Vikings didn't just excel in shipbuilding. They were also masters of the domestic and practical arts. Their homes, the longhouses, were meticulously designed to withstand the brutal northern winters. Constructed from timber, stone, and sod, the longhouses were built to trap heat and provide shelter from the relentless cold. The roofs were steeply pitched to prevent the accumulation of snow, while the thick walls helped to insulate the interior. At the heart of each longhouse was the hearth, where a fire burned day and night, providing warmth and light to the family inside. These longhouses were not just places to sleep, they were community centers where families gathered to share food, tell stories, and keep the Viking spirit alive during the long winter nights. But what truly set the Vikings apart was their relentless drive to solve problems. They didn't just accept the cold, the darkness, and the harsh conditions as part of life. They found ways to adapt, using their resourcefulness to overcome the obstacles before them. This drive to innovate was deeply embedded in their culture, influencing everything from their warfare tactics to their approach to craftsmanship. When they faced challenges, they didn't retreat or wait for the world to become easier. Instead, they found creative solutions that allowed them to press forward, no matter what. One of the most remarkable examples of Viking innovation is their ability to harness the power of the elements. In a world where the cold was a constant threat, the Vikings developed ways to not just survive but to thrive in the freezing temperatures. They created clothing and shelter that were specifically designed to combat the cold, using animal furs, wool, and leather to make garments that provided insulation and protection. The Vikings were keen observers of nature, learning to recognize which materials would offer the best protection against the cold and how to use them effectively. Animal furs, for instance, became an invaluable resource. The Vikings would trap or hunt animals like reindeer, wolves, and bears, using their pelts to create layered clothing that trapped warmth close to the body. The furs were often combined with other materials, such as wool and leather, to create complex layers of clothing that kept the wearer warm even in the most extreme conditions. The furs were not just practical, they were a symbol of the Vikings' ingenuity and their deep connection to the land. They had learned to take the materials around them and transform them into something that would protect them against nature's harshest elements. But the Vikings didn't rely solely on their physical creations to survive. They understood the power of their minds as well. They were skilled at reading the natural world, using the stars, the winds, and the changing patterns of the seasons to guide their travels. They knew when to set sail and when to wait, when to hunt and when to gather. Their knowledge of the land and the sea was unparalleled, and they had a deep understanding of how to use the environment to their advantage. This connection to the natural world was not just a survival tactic, it was a way of life. The Vikings saw themselves as part of a larger cosmic order, where every element of nature had its place and purpose. This understanding of the world around them gave them the strength to adapt to the challenges they faced. In warfare, too, the Vikings demonstrated remarkable innovation. They were not just fearsome warriors, they were strategic thinkers, capable of adapting their tactics to meet the demands of each situation. They understood that brute force alone was not enough to win battles. It was the ability to outsmart and outmaneuver the enemy that often made the difference. Their raids, for instance, were not just acts of violence but carefully planned operations designed to strike quickly and efficiently. The Vikings would use their ships to travel up rivers, bypassing traditional defenses, and launch surprise attacks on unsuspecting villages. Their mobility, speed, and tactical expertise made them nearly unstoppable. In the same way that they approached war with innovation and strategy, the Vikings also applied these qualities to their daily lives. They were expert farmers, even in the coldest regions, using every available resource to grow food and raise livestock. They learned to grow hardy crops that could withstand the cold, and they developed advanced techniques for preserving food during the winter months. They understood that nothing could be wasted, and they developed ways to use every part of an animal or plant, ensuring that they would have enough to survive the long, dark months of winter. But perhaps the most striking aspect of Viking resilience was their unwavering determination. The Vikings were not a people who gave up in the face of adversity. They did not see challenges as obstacles but as opportunities to prove their strength, ingenuity, and endurance. They were driven by a desire to conquer not just the land but the very forces of nature themselves. They understood that survival required more than just physical endurance. It required a deep well of mental strength, a willingness to face the unknown and overcome whatever came their way. In the Viking world, resilience was not just a trait, it was a way of life. Every challenge, whether it was the cold of winter, the perils of the sea, or the uncertainties of battle, was met with creativity, strength, and a steadfast resolve to thrive. This resilience, this unyielding will to survive, was the heart of Viking culture. It is what allowed them to build their world in the face of the harshest conditions and to leave a legacy that would endure for centuries. For the Vikings, survival was not merely about existing. It was about living fully, boldly, and with an unwavering belief in their ability to overcome anything that stood in their way. As we move forward in this journey through the Viking world, we will see how this remarkable resilience played a central role in their ability to not only survive the cold, but to thrive in the face of it. The ingenuity, resourcefulness, and strength of the Vikings were the pillars upon which their civilization was built, and it is this spirit that we will continue to explore as we uncover the surprising ways in which they conquered the harsh winters of their world. In the Viking world, warmth was not a luxury, it was a necessity, a lifeline that stood between life and death. The Vikings, living in one of the harshest climates on Earth, had to be acutely aware of the dangers that the cold posed. Every winter, the threat of freezing temperatures was ever present, lurking just outside the warmth of their homes and hearths. The cold could kill if not carefully managed, and so the Vikings understood that to survive, they had to prioritize warmth above all else. It was not enough simply to endure the winter months. They had to find ways to stay warm through the worst of them, to ensure that the cold did not take hold of them and strip away their strength. The danger of cold weather was particularly severe in the northernmost reaches of Scandinavia, where winters could last half the year, with little daylight and temperatures that plunged to dangerous lows. The cold was a constant adversary, a silent force that attacked from all directions: the biting winds, the relentless snowfall, the icy rivers, and the frozen earth. The Vikings knew that if they did not protect themselves from the cold, their bodies would slowly lose the ability to function, and their strength would be drained away. Frostbite, hypothermia, and other cold-related illnesses were ever-present threats, and the Vikings knew that the key to survival lay in their ability to maintain warmth in such a brutal environment. For the Vikings, warmth was something that had to be fought for every day. They did not simply wait for the winter to pass. Instead, they built their lives around finding ways to protect themselves and their families from the cold. Their clothing, their homes, and even their daily routines were all shaped by this need for warmth. And it was through these adaptations that the Vikings demonstrated their unparalleled resilience and ingenuity in the face of nature's fiercest forces. The Viking longhouse, the heart of their home, was the first and most vital line of defense against the cold. These structures, long and low, were built with materials designed to keep warmth inside. The walls were thick, often made of timber and stone, with sod placed on the roofs to provide insulation. The longhouse was designed to be a communal space, a place where families and clans would gather for warmth, food, and protection. The interior of the longhouse was centered around a hearth, a fire that burned day and night, providing not only heat but also light. The hearth was more than just a source of warmth. It was the heart of Viking life, a place where stories were shared, where food was cooked, and where families came together to face the long, dark winters as one. The hearth was a symbol of life in the Viking world. It was where the family gathered to keep the cold at bay, and its fire became a constant companion throughout the long nights. The warmth of the hearth would seep into the very bones of the Vikings, filling their homes with heat that made the bitter winds outside seem like an almost distant memory. The warmth of the fire was also a comfort, a source of security in a world that was otherwise cold and harsh. The Vikings understood that fire was not just a tool for survival, it was a means of ensuring their psychological well-being as well. In a place where the cold could make even the bravest warrior shiver, the fire offered a sense of peace, a moment of respite from the endless struggle against the elements. However, warmth wasn't something that could be easily taken for granted. Maintaining a fire in a longhouse required constant effort. The hearth needed to be fed with wood, which had to be gathered from the forests or cut from the trees nearby. During the winter months, the Vikings would spend hours each day ensuring that they had enough firewood to sustain them. It was a labor-intensive process, but it was one that the Vikings knew was essential for their survival. The cold did not give way to them, and so they had to fight back with everything they had, and the fire was their greatest weapon in this battle. Beyond the hearth, the clothing worn by the Vikings was another critical aspect of their ability to stay warm. The Viking wardrobe was a carefully crafted system of layers, each designed to serve a specific function in the fight against the cold. At the base, the Vikings wore tunics made of wool or linen, materials that trapped heat close to the body. On top of these, they wore fur-lined cloaks, coats, and capes, which provided additional insulation against the harsh winds. The furs of animals like reindeer, wolves, and bears were especially valuable, as they provided an exceptional degree of warmth. The Vikings understood that the thicker and denser the fur, the better it would protect them from the cold. These furs were not merely worn for fashion or status, they were a practical necessity for survival. The Vikings knew that in order to endure the cold, they had to trap as much heat as possible around their bodies. By layering their clothing with furs and wool, they created a barrier between their skin and the bitter winds that would otherwise strip them of warmth. The animals from which these furs came were a lifeline, providing not only warmth but also protection from the freezing cold. The fur acted as a natural insulator, trapping heat in and keeping the cold out, while the wool garments underneath helped to wick moisture away from the skin, keeping the Vikings dry and comfortable. The Vikings were also keenly aware of the importance of shelter when it came to warmth. Their longhouses were built to retain heat, with walls designed to trap warmth from the fire. The roofs, pitched steeply, allowed the snow to slide off, preventing it from accumulating and insulating the structure. Inside, the longhouses were filled with thick bedding made from wool and furs, adding another layer of protection from the cold. The bedding would be piled high with blankets, fur skins, and other materials to create a warm, insulated sleeping area. The Vikings knew that a good night's sleep was essential for maintaining the energy and strength required to face the challenges of the next day, and warmth was crucial to achieving this. But warmth wasn't confined solely to the home. The Vikings also had to find ways to stay warm during their travels and in battle. The longships that carried them on their voyages across the seas were equipped with similar insulating materials. Their boats, though primarily designed for speed and maneuverability, were also crafted to provide some degree of warmth and protection from the cold. The Vikings would often use fur and wool to line the interiors of their ships, ensuring that the warriors would be able to stay warm even in the freezing waters of the north. In battle, warmth was also essential. The Vikings wore their layered clothing and furs as part of their gear, knowing that the cold could drain their strength if they were not adequately protected. While the hearth, clothing, and homes were the primary sources of warmth, The Vikings also had a deep understanding of how to use food to keep their bodies energized and warm. During the long winters, food was not just a means of nourishment, it was a way to fuel the body and maintain warmth. Hearty stews, roasted meats, and bread made from grains were staples in the Viking diet, providing the energy needed to withstand the cold. The Vikings would often consume hot meals around the hearth, the warmth from the food combining with the heat from the fire to provide a sense of comfort during the long, dark nights. The Vikings knew that keeping their bodies warm wasn't just about insulating themselves from the cold, it was about feeding their bodies the right nutrients to keep their inner fires burning strong. In the face of such cold, the Vikings became experts at using every available resource to keep warm. They didn't simply wait for the weather to change, they took control of their environment, using fire, clothing, shelter, and food to create an ecosystem that allowed them to endure the harshest winters imaginable. Their ability to harness warmth in such a brutal environment is a testament to their resilience and resourcefulness. The cold was never truly defeated. It was a challenge that the Vikings learned to live with, to work alongside. They didn't just survive the winter, they thrived in it. The warmth they created, both physical and emotional, became the very core of their existence, allowing them to face the relentless cold with strength, courage, and an unwavering belief that they could endure. In the frozen wilderness of the Viking world, the cold was not just a nuisance, it was a constant, merciless force, capable of draining the life from anyone unprepared to face it. The Vikings, however, were not merely survivors, they were masters of their environment, able to extract life-sustaining warmth from the very animals they hunted. In the cold, dark months when the snow blanketed the earth, when the winds howled and the skies remained pale and gray for what seemed like forever, the Vikings turned to one of their most valuable resources, the fur of animals. This seemingly humble material became the key to their survival, offering warmth and protection from the relentless cold that surrounded them. It might surprise many to think of animal pelts as a vital lifeline in such a harsh climate, yet the fur of animals became as essential to the Viking people as fire or food. The furs were not just for warmth, they were a testament to Viking ingenuity and an expression of their deep connection to the land. It was through these furs that the Vikings learned to endure the bitter cold of the north. The thick, dense coats of wolves, reindeer, and bears, and even the smaller, more intricate pelts of foxes and rabbits, became woven into the fabric of Viking life in ways that were essential for survival. The process of obtaining animal fur was both practical and sacred. Hunting was no simple task. It required skill, patience, and an understanding of the animals that roamed the land. The Vikings were excellent hunters, using tools like bows, arrows, and traps to catch their quarry. They would venture into the frozen forests, tracking animals across deep snow, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every animal they hunted was valuable, not just for its meat but for its fur, which could be used for warmth, clothing, and even trade. Animal pelts were far more than just material for garments. The Vikings understood the insulating properties of fur and knew that a well-made coat or cloak could trap body heat, creating a barrier against the chill that would otherwise creep into their bones. The thick layers of fur, often lined with wool, acted as a natural insulator. The fur on the outside would shield the wearer from wind and snow, while the wool or linen on the inside would wick away moisture, keeping the skin dry and warm. This layering system, perfected over centuries of experience, was a clever adaptation to the extreme climate they lived in. The furs of the animals that roamed the northern wilderness were particularly well suited to the Vikings' needs. The reindeer, with its thick, dense fur, was one of the most sought-after animals for its ability to insulate against the cold. Its fur, combined with its waterproof qualities, made it a near-perfect material for Viking clothing. The reindeer's fur was used for coats, hats, mittens, and boots, and even for blankets that would provide warmth during the long, dark nights. The fur of the bear, too, was highly prized. Known for its dense undercoat, the bear's fur was used to line cloaks, tunics, and bedding. These furs not only kept the cold at bay but also offered a certain level of status within Viking society. To wear a bear pelt was to signify strength and connection to the wild, a mark of the warrior culture that was so central to Viking identity. Beyond the reindeer and bear, the Vikings hunted other animals for their pelts, including wolves, foxes, and even smaller creatures like rabbits and martens. Each animal brought its own unique qualities to the table. The wolf, for example, with its thick, luxurious fur, was prized not only for its warmth but also for its symbolism in Viking culture. Wolves were revered as fierce creatures, embodying the strength and cunning that Vikings admired. The fur of the wolf would often be used for the outer layers of clothing, providing protection against the harsh winds and biting cold. The fox, with its softer and finer fur, was often used for lining and trimming garments, adding an extra touch of luxury to the Vikings' wardrobes. The importance of animal furs in Viking life cannot be overstated. They were not merely practical items but a cornerstone of Viking survival, used not only for clothing but for bedding, blankets, and even sails for their ships. In a land where every resource had to be utilized to its fullest, the Vikings learned to take every part of the animal and make it work for them. The meat would be eaten, the bones could be used for tools or weapons, and the fur would be crafted into garments that would allow them to survive the cold. In fact, it is believed that some of the earliest Viking sails were made from the furs of large animals, carefully stretched and sewn together to create a material strong enough to withstand the harsh winds of the North Sea. The Vikings were meticulous in their methods of preparing animal furs. After a successful hunt, the fur would be carefully removed and treated to ensure it could provide the warmth and durability needed for clothing. The pelts would be scraped clean of any remaining flesh, then dried and tanned to preserve their softness and flexibility. Some furs would be dyed, adding color and variety to their garments. This process was an art form, requiring skill and patience. The Vikings knew that if the fur was not treated properly, it could lose its insulating properties, leaving them vulnerable to the cold. But when prepared correctly, these furs became nearly impenetrable to the elements, able to shield them from the biting winds and freezing temperatures. In addition to its practical uses, fur also played a role in Viking trade and culture. Vikings were expert traders, and their pelts became valuable commodities that were exchanged with other cultures. These furs were highly prized throughout Europe, and the Vikings traded them with merchants from distant lands, exchanging them for goods such as food, metal tools, and spices. The fur trade helped to fuel the Viking economy and connect them to the wider world, as their clothing and furs became symbols of their resourcefulness and adaptability. A Viking warrior, cloaked in the fur of a reindeer or a bear, became a symbol of strength, survival, and mastery over the harsh elements. Fur also played an important role in Viking rituals and beliefs. Many of the animals that provided furs, such as the wolf, bear, and reindeer, held symbolic significance in Viking mythology. The wolf, for example, was seen as a creature that embodied the fierce and untamed aspects of the Viking warrior spirit. To wear the pelt of a wolf was to take on some of that strength and power, to embody the spirit of the wild. The bear was similarly revered, associated with the god Odin, and believed to represent courage and bravery in battle. To wear the pelt of a bear was to invoke the strength and protection of the gods themselves. The Vikings' use of animal furs is a testament to their deep connection with the natural world and their ability to turn the resources around them into tools for survival. The animals that roamed the forests, tundras, and mountains of Scandinavia were not just sources of food and material, they were symbols of the land itself, living embodiments of the challenges the Vikings faced. Through their hunting, their craftsmanship, and their ingenuity, the Vikings created a way of life that was intricately woven into the fabric of the land. Their use of animal furs, far from being an afterthought or a mere necessity, was an expression of their resilience, their respect for nature, and their remarkable ability to adapt to the harshest of environments. In the end, the furs of the animals that roamed the Viking lands were far more than just material for clothing. They were the key to survival, the shield against the cold, and a symbol of the strength and resourcefulness that defined the Viking people. When the cold winds of winter howled and the snow piled high, the Vikings knew that they could endure, not because they were invincible, but because they had learned to master the cold with the very creatures that shared their world. Through their furs, the Vikings turned the harshest environment into a home, and the cold became something to conquer, not to fear. The Viking people, living on the edge of the world where the sun barely touched the land in winter and the snow buried everything beneath its weight, had one clear and undeniable truth to face. To survive, they had to conquer the cold. It wasn't just a matter of enduring the harsh winters. It was about mastering the elements and finding ways to live, and even thrive, in an environment that sought to drain the life from anyone who wasn't prepared. The cold was a constant adversary, one that demanded creativity, ingenuity, and resilience. And so, over generations, the Vikings developed sophisticated clothing techniques, transforming simple materials into garments capable of withstanding some of the harshest conditions on Earth. At the heart of Viking clothing was the need to stay warm, dry, and protected. But warmth alone was not enough. The Vikings needed clothing that could withstand the forces of nature, that could endure the cold, the rain, the snow, and the wind. They needed clothing that could keep them moving, keep them fighting, and keep them alive. The harsh realities of the Viking world shaped their approach to clothing. They knew that survival wasn't just about having enough to wear, it was about having the right gear to endure the extremes they faced daily. The Viking wardrobe was meticulously designed, with each piece serving a specific purpose in the fight against the cold. The clothing was not merely a series of items to cover the body, it was a layered system of protection, carefully thought out to trap warmth, keep moisture at bay, and provide flexibility and mobility. The basic structure of Viking clothing included tunics, trousers, and cloaks, all made from natural materials like wool, linen, and animal hides. These materials were used not just for comfort, but for their ability to insulate and regulate temperature. Wool, in particular, was a cornerstone of Viking clothing. It was an incredibly versatile material, capable of keeping the body warm even when it was wet, making it ideal for the damp, cold conditions of Scandinavia. The Vikings would spin and weave wool into cloth, using it to create tunics, trousers, and socks that were worn as a first layer against the skin. Wool's natural properties allowed it to breathe, keeping the wearer warm while still allowing moisture to escape, a crucial factor in a world where the temperature could drop to deadly levels. Wool also had another advantage: it could be sourced locally, making it readily available throughout the Viking lands. Over wool, the Vikings would wear leather and fur, providing an extra layer of protection against the biting winds. The leather would often be used for outer garments like jackets and pants, while the fur would be layered on top to provide insulation. The furs of animals like reindeer, bears, and wolves were highly prized, not just for their warmth but for their ability to withstand the cold in ways other materials could not. A reindeer hide, for example, was waterproof and insulated, making it the perfect material for outerwear. The fur would be meticulously tanned, softened, and sewn into cloaks, hoods, and coats. These furs became a shield against the elements, offering the Vikings protection against rain, snow, and even the harsh winds that could freeze a man's face in minutes. In addition to the layered wool, leather, and fur garments, the Vikings also employed a variety of accessories to further protect themselves from the cold. The distinctive Viking cloaks, often made from heavy wool or fur, were designed not only to keep the body warm but also to protect the neck and head. These cloaks were often fastened with brooches, intricate metal clasps that allowed the Vikings to adjust their clothing for maximum warmth and comfort. The hooded cloaks were particularly essential during the coldest months, as they provided a shield for the head and neck, areas that were particularly vulnerable to frostbite. Viking women, too, wore similar layers of clothing, often with added decorative elements that reflected their status within their communities. The Vikings were not only practical in their clothing choices but also understood the importance of maintaining a sense of identity and pride through their attire. Footwear was another critical component of Viking clothing. In a land where the ground could freeze solid, becoming treacherous with ice and snow, the Vikings needed shoes that were not only warm but durable. Viking boots were often made from leather, reinforced with fur or wool linings to keep the feet insulated from the cold. The boots were designed for practicality and could be worn during battle, travel, and everyday life. Some Vikings also wore mittens or gloves made from leather or fur, further protecting their hands from the freezing air. Leather soles were often thick and flexible, allowing the Vikings to move quickly across both frozen ground and soft snow. The Vikings' ability to craft such effective clothing came from years of experience in their harsh environment. They were not just wearing clothing to stay warm, they were dressing strategically to keep their bodies functioning in an environment that could shut down the body's core in minutes. The craftsmanship involved in creating these clothes was a mix of necessity and artistry. Every seam, every piece of fur or leather sewn into place, was done with the utmost care. Viking seamstresses and tailors became adept at turning animal pelts into highly functional garments that were not just effective but durable. Clothing wasn't simply made for one season, it had to withstand the wear and tear of both time and the elements. Viking soldiers, too, had specialized clothing for protection during battle. They wore chainmail shirts, known as hauberk, over their tunics. These shirts, made from interwoven rings of metal, provided some of the best protection available during the time. While chainmail wasn't ideal for warmth, it was designed to protect against stabbing and slashing blows, which was just as important for survival as keeping warm. In the cold months, the Vikings would wear layers of wool beneath the mail, helping to insulate them against the chill. They also used shields, which were made of wood and leather, and could provide some protection from the wind while waiting for battle. In addition to their practical clothing, the Vikings understood that warmth came not just from their garments, but from their movements. The Vikings were a physically active people, always on the move, whether they were traveling across the seas, hiking through snowy terrain, or engaging in battle. The clothing they wore needed to accommodate their physicality, offering them both warmth and flexibility. Viking clothing was designed to be comfortable in motion, allowing the wearer to fight, sail, and live without being encumbered by heavy layers. Unlike modern jackets or coats that may restrict movement, Viking clothing was crafted to move with the body, providing both the protection needed from the cold and the freedom necessary to maintain the Viking lifestyle. In many ways, the Vikings' approach to clothing was a direct reflection of their larger worldview. They were not people who waited for the cold to pass or for the world to change. Instead, they adapted, they innovated, and they created solutions that allowed them to conquer the environment around them. Their clothing was a reflection of their resilience. It wasn't just a way to stay warm, it was a statement of their ability to live and thrive, no matter how severe the elements. The Viking way of life was inherently tied to the land, to the forces of nature, and to the endless struggle against the cold. In a world where everything seemed to be working against them, the Vikings used their creativity, their resourcefulness, and their hands-on approach to create clothing that could withstand even the most brutal winters. From their woolen tunics to their fur-lined cloaks, their leather boots to their chainmail hauberks, every piece of clothing was a carefully crafted answer to the challenges they faced. The Vikings knew that in the coldest corners of the world, warmth was not just a comfort, it was a matter of survival. Through their clothing innovations, the Vikings found a way to endure, to survive, and to live, even in the harshest conditions imaginable. In the realm of Viking survival, fire was nothing short of a lifeline. The cold was not just an inconvenience, it was an enemy, always lurking at the edges of their villages and settlements, waiting to strike at the first sign of weakness. Yet, amidst the bone-chilling temperatures and relentless winters, the Vikings had discovered the most fundamental of tools to fight back against nature's harshest element: fire. In a world where darkness stretched long into the day and the sun barely touched the ground, fire was the Vikings' companion, protector, and source of comfort. It was in the heart of the hearth that the Vikings found warmth, light, and the strength to endure day after bitter day. The importance of fire in Viking life cannot be overstated. The Vikings lived in a world where the winter months could last for months on end, where the cold would seep into every corner of the world, and where the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly across the horizon. For the Viking people, fire was the key to surviving these brutal conditions. It was a source of physical warmth, but it was also a beacon of hope and life in a world that seemed determined to freeze everything in its path. The Viking longhouses, where families gathered to eat, sleep, and spend their days, were designed with fire at their very center. Each longhouse featured a large hearth in the middle of the room, an open fire that burned day and night. The hearth was far more than just a functional element, it was the heart of Viking social life. The fire not only provided warmth but also light, a rare and precious commodity during the long, dark winters. It was around the hearth that families would gather, sharing stories, songs, and food to pass the time during the endless nights. The warmth of the fire would wrap around them like a blanket, protecting them from the icy winds that howled outside, keeping them safe from the frigid air that could freeze a person's breath in an instant. The hearth was also a practical necessity, one that kept the Viking people alive. Cooking in the Viking world was not done in the modern, efficient kitchens we know today. Instead, meals were prepared directly over the open flame of the hearth, with large pots of stew or meat simmering for hours. The fire was crucial not only for warmth but for cooking, drying meat, and even preserving food. In such an unforgiving environment, nothing could be wasted, and the Vikings would often smoke or cure meat and fish over the fire, ensuring they had enough provisions to survive through the harshest of winters. But the fire was not only a symbol of warmth and food. It was also a means of protection. In the wilderness, where animals like wolves, bears, and other predators roamed the land, fire provided a barrier, a way to keep the dangers of the wild at bay. A well-maintained fire would deter wild animals from coming too close, offering the Vikings a sense of security in the otherwise unpredictable landscape. This was especially important during the winter months when food became scarce, and animals were more likely to venture closer to human settlements in search of sustenance. The flickering light and warmth of a fire would send a signal to the creatures of the forest, a reminder that the Vikings were not to be trifled with. Beyond the home, the fire was a central part of Viking travel and exploration. The Vikings were skilled navigators and seafarers, traveling vast distances across the seas to raid, trade, and explore new lands. On these long voyages, fire was just as crucial as it was back at home. Viking ships, though designed for speed and agility, were often exposed to the cold winds of the sea, and the crew needed fire to stay warm and cook their food. In the absence of land, fire became a vital part of their survival at sea. The Vikings would create small, portable fires on their ships, using carefully constructed stoves or fire pits to cook meals and heat their bodies. They even used fire to light their way on foggy nights or during long stretches of darkness, when the cold and the lack of visibility could disorient them. To keep the fire burning in such harsh conditions was no easy feat. The Vikings were experts at fire making, and they understood that creating a reliable fire was an art form in itself. They used materials from the land, wood, moss, dried grasses, and animal fat, to create tinder that could be easily ignited. The Vikings often carried small fire-starting kits with them when they traveled, and their skills in starting a fire in the wild were legendary. The fire starter, often made from flint and steel, was a prized possession, passed down through generations. It was a tool that allowed the Vikings to strike sparks, which would then catch on the dry tinder and ignite the fire. Once started, the fire would be carefully tended, fed with more wood to keep it burning strong. In addition to the hearths and portable fires, the Vikings also developed methods for utilizing fire to protect themselves from the cold in their clothing. The process of drying and curing animal pelts over a fire was vital in preparing their clothing for the winter. The heat from the fire would soften the hides, making them more pliable, and would also help to preserve the furs, keeping them from becoming brittle in the dry cold. The Vikings used the warmth of the fire to dry their wet clothes, boots, and gear, ensuring that they would be able to face the next storm with dry and insulated clothing. Without the fire to dry their garments, the Vikings would have found themselves at a severe disadvantage. Wet clothing in freezing temperatures could cause frostbite, hypothermia, or worse, so the ability to dry their gear quickly was critical. Beyond its role in daily survival, fire had a deeper, more symbolic significance for the Vikings. Fire was often associated with the gods, and it played an important role in Viking rituals and ceremonies. The Vikings believed that fire was a sacred element, a force that connected the human world with the divine. The hearth was seen as a symbolic representation of the sun, and it was around the fire that many Viking rituals took place. When the Vikings set sail on long voyages, they would offer prayers and sacrifices to the gods to ensure that their fires would stay burning and their ships would remain safe. Fire was not only a practical tool but also a spiritual force, one that guided them through their darkest hours and connected them to the sacred and divine. In battle, fire also played a key role. The Vikings were known for their ferocity in combat, and they often used fire as a weapon. The use of torches and fire arrows was common during Viking raids. The Vikings would set fire to buildings and ships, using fire to create chaos and fear among their enemies. They knew that fire was a powerful weapon, one that could not only destroy but also demoralize their foes. Fire became an extension of their war strategy, just as it was an extension of their daily lives. Whether for survival, protection, or conquest, fire was a constant presence in the Viking world. The survival of the Vikings in the harshest of climates was not just due to their physical prowess or their ability to craft ingenious tools and structures. It was also because they understood the importance of fire in their daily lives. Fire was what allowed them to cook, to stay warm, to protect themselves from predators, and to keep moving across the seas. It was the spark that fueled their lives, both physically and spiritually. Without fire, the Vikings would not have survived the cold, the dark, or the dangers of their world. Fire, in many ways, was the heartbeat of Viking life, and through it, they mastered the cold that would otherwise have consumed them. In the unforgiving wilderness of the Viking world, where winter stretched endlessly and the cold could invade even the most well-built homes, survival was not an individual endeavor, it was a communal one. The Vikings understood that to endure the freezing temperatures, they had to rely on each other, bound together not just by kinship but by the shared need for warmth and protection. In a world where the cold could claim lives in an instant, the unity of the Viking community became a powerful force, one that not only kept them physically warm but also emotionally connected, providing the strength to face the harsh winters together. The concept of community was deeply ingrained in Viking society, and nowhere was this more evident than in the way they shared warmth during the long winter months. The Viking longhouse, the heart of every settlement, was more than just a building. It was a space where families, clans, and entire communities came together to survive the cold. The structure of these homes was designed for togetherness. Longhouses were typically large, communal spaces, often built with thick wooden walls and a central hearth that provided heat for the entire structure. This layout was purposeful. The Viking people knew that by gathering together in a single space, they could conserve warmth, making it more efficient and helping to stave off the chill that would otherwise permeate every corner of their homes. Within the longhouse, warmth was shared not just through the fire, but through the very presence of others. The hearth at the center of the longhouse was symbolic of this unity. Families would sit around the fire, cooking meals, telling stories, and working together to maintain the fire that would keep them all alive. This was a space of shared labor and shared warmth, where each person's efforts contributed to the overall survival of the group. The fire would burn throughout the day and night, its warmth not only keeping the inhabitants physically comfortable but also creating an atmosphere of security and camaraderie. The Vikings knew that the cold was something they had to face as a community, and the hearth became a place where that collective strength was nurtured. The sense of shared warmth extended beyond the physical warmth generated by the fire. The long winter nights could be isolating, with little light to break the endless darkness, and the cold could make even the most resilient soul feel vulnerable. But in the presence of others, there was comfort, not just in the heat of the fire, but in the solidarity of the group. The Vikings were a people who thrived in close-knit communities. In their longhouses, they didn't just share physical warmth, they shared stories, songs, and laughter that helped to lighten the mood during the long, dark months. The warmth of human connection was as vital as the fire that crackled in the hearth. The collective experience of surviving together, of enduring the bitter cold as one, created bonds that were unbreakable. Viking families and clans would often sleep in close quarters, with several generations sharing a room to maximize the warmth generated by the fire. Sleeping arrangements were not divided by age or gender. Instead, the community would sleep in large groups on raised platforms or sleeping areas covered in furs and wool blankets. These shared sleeping spaces ensured that the warmth from the fire would be spread across the room, keeping everyone close enough to benefit from the heat. The close proximity also helped to maintain a sense of security, as the Vikings understood the dangers posed by the cold and the need to stay close to one another for protection. In the dead of winter, the risk of hypothermia or frostbite was ever present, and the more bodies gathered in one place, the better chance everyone had of staying warm through the night. But warmth wasn't just about staying physically comfortable, it was about emotional survival too. The long winters brought with them not only physical challenges but psychological ones. The isolation of the cold, the lack of sunlight, and the monotony of endless days under a blanket of snow could wear down even the strongest. But in the Viking world, People were not expected to face this solitude alone. The communal nature of Viking life meant that everyone, regardless of age, gender, or social status, played a role in maintaining the warmth of the community. From the youngest child, who might have helped by feeding the fire or bringing wood to the hearth, to the eldest member of the clan, who would share stories and wisdom to lift spirits, everyone contributed to the collective survival. This sense of shared purpose gave the Vikings a psychological strength that helped them cope with the extreme isolation that came with the winter months. Viking social structures were also designed to reinforce this sense of collective warmth. Leadership was not just about individual power but about ensuring the welfare of the entire community. Chiefs and clan leaders, who were often chosen based on wisdom, strength, and experience, had the responsibility of looking after their people during the harsh winters. These leaders were expected to manage resources, ensuring that firewood was stocked, food was preserved, and that the community stayed united in the face of adversity. But leadership was not just about logistics, it was about the moral warmth of the group. A good leader would foster a sense of unity, encourage collective efforts, and ensure that no one was left behind in the struggle against the cold. The sense of warmth in the Viking community also extended to the way they cared for the elderly and the sick. In Viking society, the well-being of each person was the concern of everyone. The elderly were respected, not only for their age but for the wisdom they could pass down to younger generations. They were given a place of honor in the longhouse, near the fire, where their knowledge could be shared, and their experience could contribute to the survival of the community. In times of illness, it was the collective responsibility of the group to care for those who were struggling, whether they were young children or older members. This sense of mutual care ensured that no one faced the dangers of winter alone. Beyond the walls of the longhouse, the Viking community would also come together in times of hardship. During the darkest winters, when food was scarce and the cold seemed never-ending, the Vikings knew that they had to rely on their bonds with their neighbors and clan members. If one family's resources ran low, it was common for the community to come together to share what they had, whether it was firewood, food, or other supplies. This sense of reciprocity was deeply embedded in Viking culture, and it was especially evident during the harsh winter months. The shared struggle against the cold created an environment where individual survival was always tied to the survival of the group. This created a deep sense of loyalty and kinship that bound the Vikings together, making their communities stronger and more resilient in the face of adversity. In the Viking world, the shared warmth of the community was a powerful force that transcended physical comfort. It was an emotional and psychological connection that allowed them to weather the worst of winters together. The cold, though fierce and unrelenting, could never fully take hold of a people who had learned to survive through unity. The fire in the hearth, the closeness of shared space, the communal effort to stay warm, all of these elements created a warmth that went far beyond the simple act of keeping out the cold. It was a warmth of spirit, of connection, of mutual care, and of shared strength. And through this warmth, the Viking people not only survived the darkest, coldest winters but thrived, united by the knowledge that together, they could endure anything. The Viking people, much like their environment, were formidable and resilient. They faced some of the harshest winters known to humankind, where snow blanketed the land for months and temperatures plummeted to life-threatening levels. In a world where survival depended on the ability to withstand the cold, the Vikings were not only adept at coping with the winter, they were masters at turning the very environment that threatened them into a resource. One of their greatest innovations in this regard was the way they built and insulated their homes. The Viking longhouses, which served as the center of family and communal life, were designed with a deep understanding of both the elements and the need for warmth. The way they constructed their homes allowed them to harness the natural environment in ways that kept them safe, warm, and secure through the long, brutal winters. The longhouse was the heart of Viking society, the place where families gathered to eat, sleep, and share the warmth of the fire. But beyond its function as a communal space, the longhouse was also a marvel of Viking ingenuity. The design of the longhouse was specifically tailored to combat the cold and make the most of the limited resources available. Built primarily from wood and thatched with grass, these homes were more than just structures. They were carefully crafted fortresses against the relentless chill of winter. The walls of Viking longhouses were made from thick, vertical timbers, often placed closely together to limit the amount of cold air that could enter. These walls would be further insulated with layers of turf or moss, materials that were abundant in the Viking landscape. These layers of moss, grass, and other natural elements served as the perfect insulators, trapping heat inside the longhouse and preventing the cold from creeping in. The roof of the longhouse was also carefully constructed to maximize warmth. It was typically made of thatch, a material that was light but highly effective at keeping the heat inside. The Vikings understood the importance of proper ventilation, and their roofs were designed to allow smoke from the central hearth to escape while maintaining the warmth generated by the fire. The smoke hole, or smoke hole as it was known, was positioned at the peak of the roof, ensuring that the heat from the fire could rise and be distributed throughout the space, while the smoke could escape without filling the room. The walls were often thick enough to retain heat, while the roofs provided an additional barrier against the elements. Inside the longhouse, the Vikings made use of every available space to conserve heat. The design of the interior was functional, with families sleeping in close proximity to one another to share warmth during the long, cold nights. The beds, typically raised platforms made of wood, were often covered with furs and thick blankets to provide additional insulation. The use of animal pelts, including those of reindeer, wolves, and bears, helped to trap body heat and create an insulating barrier against the cold. The warmth generated by the central hearth would radiate outward, and the placement of the sleeping areas near the fire ensured that the coldest parts of the longhouse were farthest from the central warmth source. The placement of the hearth itself was a crucial part of the longhouse's design. The hearth, which was often located in the center of the longhouse, was the source of not only warmth but light. In the dark, cold winters of the Viking world, the hearth became the focal point of the home, providing a steady source of light that would guide people through the long, dark nights. But the fire was also a practical necessity. The hearth was used for cooking, for drying clothes and meat, and for preserving food. The heat from the fire would radiate outward, warming the area closest to it while also helping to dry out wet clothes and damp furs. This made the hearth indispensable for maintaining both the physical and psychological well-being of the Viking family. The importance of insulation in Viking homes was not limited to just the walls, roof, and central hearth. The Vikings were resourceful in using the natural environment to further protect themselves from the cold. For instance, in the harsh winters when food was scarce, they would rely on drying techniques to preserve their food. Meats, fish, and even fruits would be carefully hung near the fire or in the rafters, allowing them to dry slowly in the warmth of the hearth. This process not only preserved the food for consumption during the winter months but also helped to regulate the humidity within the longhouse, ensuring that the air remained dry and breathable. The careful use of natural materials like wood, animal hides, and moss helped to create an environment where the Vikings could maintain both warmth and comfort, even in the depths of winter. Moreover, the Vikings understood that insulation wasn't just about the structure itself but about maintaining the proper balance of heat throughout the day and night. They often built their homes to face in the direction of the sun, allowing the warmth of the sun's rays to enter the longhouse during the short days of winter. The homes were often situated in sheltered areas, away from the biting winds that could whip across the open fields. By choosing locations carefully, the Vikings could take advantage of natural windbreaks, such as forests or hills, which helped to keep the cold at bay. This clever positioning allowed the Vikings to maximize the heat of the sun and minimize the impact of the freezing winds. Another key feature of Viking home insulation was their use of smoke to enhance the warmth inside their longhouses. While the idea of having smoke inside a home may seem counterproductive, the Vikings knew how to use it to their advantage. The smoke from the fire helped to warm the air inside the longhouse, and the soot that built up in the walls actually served to further insulate the structure. The thicker the layer of soot, the more effective the walls became at retaining heat. The smoke also helped to keep the interiors of the longhouse dry, preventing the buildup of moisture that could lead to the growth of mold or rot. The use of smoke as a form of insulation was an effective, if unconventional, way of using the elements to create a warmer living environment. Viking innovations in insulating homes were not only practical but also a testament to their adaptability and resourcefulness. The harsh conditions of their homeland forced them to find ways to live in harmony with nature, to work with the environment rather than against it. They learned to use the materials at their disposal, wood, moss, fur, and animal hides, to create homes that would protect them from the worst that nature could throw at them. The design of the longhouse, the careful placement of the hearth, and the use of natural materials to insulate the walls and roofs all contributed to a living space that could withstand the coldest winters. Through ingenuity and an intimate understanding of the land, the Vikings were able to not only survive but thrive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. In the end, the Viking longhouse was more than just a structure. It was a symbol of their ability to adapt and endure. Every beam, every thatch, every piece of fur used in the construction of these homes was a testament to the Viking spirit. The cold was relentless, but the Viking people, bound together by their homes and their shared determination, found ways to conquer it, creating warm, enduring spaces that allowed them to live, work, and thrive through even the darkest of winters. In the Viking world, survival was not merely a matter of physical strength or willpower, it was about adaptability. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they mastered it by understanding the unique environments they inhabited and exploiting the resources available to them. From the dense, frozen forests of Scandinavia to the icy, windswept coasts of Greenland, the Viking people adapted their lifestyle to the diverse climates they encountered, developing ingenious methods to thrive in the harshest conditions imaginable. Each region they inhabited, explored, or conquered presented a new challenge, and the Vikings met these challenges head-on with resourcefulness, perseverance, and a deep respect for nature. The core of Viking adaptation to local environments for winter survival was their intimate knowledge of the land. Every element of their survival strategy, whether it was their construction techniques, clothing, or resource management, was tailored to the specific needs of the environment they found themselves in. This ability to adapt was rooted in the Viking ethos, to not just endure nature's trials, but to live in harmony with them, turning what might be a threat to survival into an opportunity. In Scandinavia, the Viking homeland, the winters were long and bitterly cold. Snow would blanket the land for months, and the sun's pale light seemed barely to touch the earth, leaving days that were short and nights that stretched endlessly into the darkness. Yet the Vikings turned this frozen landscape to their advantage. They knew the land well, from the deep fjords to the towering mountains. This knowledge allowed them to locate and harvest natural resources that were vital for winter survival. One of the most critical resources in these northern lands was wood, which was abundant in the Viking heartland. The forests provided not just firewood, but also the raw materials for building homes, ships, and tools. The Vikings were skilled woodworkers, and they developed tools and techniques that allowed them to cut, shape, and craft wood with incredible precision. They would fell trees, using the timber for the construction of their longhouses, and smaller branches for firewood. Even in winter, when the trees were dormant, the Vikings could harvest wood that was dense enough to burn for hours, keeping their homes warm through the coldest nights. This close relationship with the forests allowed the Vikings to ensure a steady supply of heat, a crucial aspect of surviving the long winters. In addition to wood, the Vikings relied heavily on animal products for both warmth and sustenance. Fur and leather were used not just for clothing but for insulation within their homes. As discussed, the Vikings hunted animals like reindeer, wolves, and bears, whose furs were made into coats, cloaks, boots, and even bedding. These furs provided warmth and protection against the cold, but they also became essential tools for survival. When the Vikings hunted, they took care to use every part of the animal. The meat was dried or preserved for consumption, the bones were fashioned into tools, and the sinew and hides became integral to their clothing and homes. The Vikings were not merely passive inhabitants of their environment, they actively shaped it. When they built their longhouses, they did so with an understanding of the natural elements. The design of the homes allowed them to withstand the cold winds and deep snows. The longhouse itself was an adaptation to the local environment, built with thick walls of timber and often covered with moss or turf to act as insulation. The roofs were steeply pitched to prevent snow from accumulating, and the walls were designed to trap heat. Inside, the hearth was central to the layout, with the heat from the fire radiating outward, warming the people who gathered around it. This design ensured that the Vikings could stay warm even in the most extreme winter conditions. When the Vikings ventured further into more northerly and unforgiving territories, like Greenland or the icy shores of Iceland, their ability to adapt became even more critical. The cold in these regions was more extreme, and the isolation even greater. In Greenland, the Vikings faced a landscape where temperatures could dip to incredibly low levels, with long stretches of darkness and months without the sun. The land was barren in many places, offering little in the way of natural resources beyond what the Vikings could bring with them. Yet they adapted, using their knowledge of Scandinavian construction methods to build homes that could withstand the intense cold. They would use stones and turf to build sturdy, insulated homes, with thick walls that protected them from the biting winds. Inside these homes, the hearth continued to play a central role, providing both heat and a place to cook the food that was gathered or hunted. One of the key challenges in these northern regions was the scarcity of fuel for fires. While wood was abundant in Scandinavia, it was not as easily found in Greenland, where much of the land was covered by glaciers and tundra. Here, the Vikings made use of what they could find, using driftwood that washed ashore, as well as animal dung, to fuel their fires. The use of animal dung as a fuel source was a practical adaptation, especially during the long winters when other resources were scarce. It was a common practice in many ancient cultures, and the Vikings were no exception. By gathering and drying dung, they created a reliable source of fuel that could be used to heat their homes and cook their food. This adaptability in the face of limited resources showed the Vikings' resourcefulness and determination to survive, even in the harshest conditions. In addition to their innovative housing and fuel strategies, the Vikings also adapted their clothing to suit the extreme environments in which they lived. As mentioned earlier, animal pelts played a vital role in Viking clothing, providing warmth and protection against the elements. However, the Vikings also adapted their clothing techniques based on the specific environmental conditions of each region. In Greenland, for example, where the cold was more intense, they would wear thicker layers of fur and leather, sometimes layering their clothing with insulating materials like wool. The ability to wear multiple layers helped to trap warmth and regulate body temperature, allowing the Vikings to endure the cold for longer periods of time. Beyond clothing, the Vikings developed methods for acquiring food that suited the local environment. In the far north, where crops were difficult to grow, the Vikings turned to hunting, fishing, and herding for sustenance. They hunted seals, walruses, and whales, creatures that thrived in the icy waters surrounding Greenland. They also relied on reindeer, which were well adapted to the cold and could provide meat, fur, and antlers. Fishing, too, played a crucial role in Viking survival, especially in coastal areas where fresh fish was abundant. The Vikings were excellent fishers, using boats to travel across the icy waters, casting nets and lines to gather food that would help them survive the long winters. In places like Iceland, they also relied on geothermal springs, which provided a natural source of heat that could be used to cook food, wash clothes, and even warm their homes. The Vikings' adaptability wasn't limited to just their physical environment, it extended to their social structures as well. In more isolated regions, like Greenland, the community became even more important. Survival in these harsh climates was a collective effort, and the Vikings relied on strong social bonds to ensure mutual aid and support. The community would often share resources, whether it was firewood, food, or knowledge about the best hunting grounds. This sense of solidarity was essential in maintaining both physical and emotional well-being during the long, isolated winters. The cold might have been their constant enemy, but the warmth of the Viking community was what allowed them to endure. Through their ingenious adaptations, the Vikings were able to survive and even thrive in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Whether it was through their construction techniques, their clothing innovations, their resourceful use of local materials, or their ability to work together as a community, the Vikings showed an unparalleled capacity to adapt to the challenges of winter survival. Their legacy is not just one of warriors and explorers but also of people who understood the land they lived on, respected its power, and learned to live in harmony with it, transforming it into a place where they could build homes, raise families, and carry on their way of life, no matter how severe the winter. In the harsh and unforgiving landscape of the Viking world, Survival hinged on a deep and intimate connection with the land and the creatures that inhabited it. The Vikings, ever resourceful and adaptive, recognized early on that animals were not just companions or sources of food, they were central to their very survival, particularly during the long, frigid winters. The Vikings had a profound respect for the animals they hunted, herded, and lived alongside, understanding that each species offered more than just meat for the table. Animals were essential for warmth, mobility, food preservation, and even social cohesion. The bond between the Vikings and their animals was one of mutual dependence, a relationship that allowed both to thrive in an environment where the cold could easily overpower even the hardiest of human beings. The most immediately obvious use of animals by the Vikings for winter survival was in the realm of food. During the brutal winter months, when fresh crops were impossible to grow and resources were scarce, the Vikings relied heavily on hunting and animal husbandry for sustenance. The wilds of Scandinavia, with their thick forests, rocky outcrops, and icy rivers, were home to a rich variety of animals, many of which became staples of the Viking diet. Moose, reindeer, elk, and wild boar were regularly hunted, their meat providing vital nutrition in the form of protein and fat. The Vikings were skilled hunters, using bows, spears, and even traps to catch their quarry. They understood the migratory patterns of these animals and knew when and where to find them, ensuring a steady supply of meat even in the coldest months. But hunting was not the only way the Vikings used animals for food during winter. They also practiced a variety of preservation techniques to ensure that their food would last through the long, dark months. The Vikings were expert in drying, smoking, salting, and curing meat, methods that allowed them to store large quantities of food for the winter. The meats of reindeer, elk, and boar, as well as fish and fowl, would be carefully prepared and preserved, ensuring that no part of the animal went to waste. The cold, dry air of the winter months was ideal for smoking and drying meat, and the Vikings took full advantage of this natural refrigeration system. The preserved meat would be stored in the cool interiors of the longhouse, hanging from rafters or kept in large containers, ready to be cooked when needed. In addition to providing food, animals were also integral to the Vikings' clothing and insulation strategies. As discussed earlier, the Vikings crafted garments from the hides and furs of animals, using them to protect themselves from the biting cold. The pelts of reindeer, bears, wolves, and other animals were carefully tanned and worked into clothing. These furs were not only warm but durable, designed to withstand the harshest of conditions. The Vikings made use of every part of the animal, from the fur to the bones to the sinew, to create clothing, boots, cloaks, and even bedding. Fur-lined boots, mittens, and cloaks became essential items in the Viking wardrobe, offering not just warmth but the mobility needed to endure the cold months. These garments were highly effective at trapping body heat, allowing the Vikings to stay active in freezing temperatures. Beyond their skins and fur, the Vikings also made use of the bones and antlers of animals. Antlers, in particular, were highly prized by the Vikings for their durability and versatility. They were used to craft tools, weapons, and ornaments, as well as furniture and even religious idols. The bones of animals like reindeer and moose were fashioned into everything from needles and combs to knife handles and spear tips. In this way, animals were integral not only to the Vikings' physical survival but also to their cultural and spiritual life. The relationship between the Vikings and the animals they relied on was both practical and deeply symbolic, with animals often representing qualities of strength, resilience, and endurance. The Vikings also understood the importance of horses and sled dogs in winter survival, particularly for transportation and mobility. The rugged terrain of Scandinavia made travel difficult, especially during the winter months when the snow could cover the land for weeks on end. The Vikings, however, had developed a sophisticated system for traveling across these challenging landscapes, relying on their horses and sled dogs to carry supplies, pull sleds, and transport people. Horses were essential for traveling long distances, especially when the Vikings needed to venture out for trade, raiding, or exploration. They were sturdy animals, well suited to the rough, icy roads and trails of the Nordic landscape. The Vikings bred horses specifically for these harsh conditions, creating a breed that was compact, strong, and able to withstand the cold. Sled dogs, too, played a critical role in Viking winter survival. The cold, snowy conditions of the north meant that Vikings often needed to rely on dogs to pull sleds loaded with supplies, equipment, and food. These sled dogs were not the same as modern-day huskies but were bred for their ability to haul heavy loads across snow and ice. The Vikings were skilled at training their dogs for this purpose, using them not only for transportation but also for hunting. Sled dogs could track animals over long distances, helping the Vikings to hunt game even in the deep snow. Additionally, dogs provided companionship and security, acting as sentries for the Vikings' camps, alerting them to any approaching dangers, whether from predators or rival groups. The Vikings' reliance on animals for mobility didn't stop at horses and dogs. The Viking ships, which are some of the most iconic and enduring symbols of their culture, were also an important adaptation for winter survival. While ships are typically associated with the warmer months of raiding and exploration, they were also essential for long-distance travel during the winter. The Vikings' ships were designed to handle rough seas and icy waters, with shallow drafts that allowed them to navigate narrow, frozen rivers and fjords. These ships were often outfitted with thick animal pelts to protect the crew from the biting winds and frigid temperatures. The ability to travel across the sea or along frozen rivers gave the Vikings a significant advantage in terms of mobility, allowing them to access resources, trade routes, and new territories even during the coldest months of the year. In addition to these practical uses, animals were also vital to the Vikings' cultural and spiritual beliefs. The Vikings had a rich mythology and many of their gods and legends were tied to animals. Odin, the chief god of the Vikings, rode an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, symbolizing the god's power over death and the afterlife. The wolf was another animal deeply connected to the Vikings, symbolizing strength, loyalty, and ferocity. Wolves were often featured in Viking art and were revered as sacred animals, representing the untamed nature of the world they inhabited. The bond between the Vikings and animals went beyond the material, it was spiritual, too, with the Vikings seeing in animals both a reflection of their own strength and a guide to understanding the natural world. The Vikings also engaged in animal sacrifices as part of their religious rituals. These sacrifices were often performed to appease the gods and ensure a successful harvest, a safe journey, or protection from the harsh winter elements. Animal sacrifices, especially those of horses and cattle, were seen as offerings to the gods, demonstrating gratitude for the gifts of life, sustenance, and protection that the animals provided. These practices further deepened the connection between the Vikings and the animals that were so essential to their survival. In conclusion, the Viking relationship with animals was one of profound importance. The animals they hunted, herded, and relied on for survival were more than just sources of food or warmth, they were integral to the Vikings' ability to endure and thrive in the harshest of environments. From the fur-lined garments that protected them from the cold to the horses and sled dogs that enabled them to travel across snow-covered landscapes, animals were central to Viking life. The Vikings' resourcefulness in utilizing every part of the animal, from fur to bone to sinew, speaks to their deep understanding of the environment and their ability to turn nature's challenges into advantages. In their mythology and their daily lives, animals were revered not just for their utility but for the strength, resilience, and loyalty they symbolized. Through their bond with animals, the Vikings not only survived the brutal winters of the north, they forged a way of life that was inextricably linked to the creatures that shared their world. Winter in the Viking world was more than just a physical challenge. It was a psychological battle that could break even the strongest of wills. The long, brutal months of snow, ice, and near-constant darkness created an environment that tested the human spirit. While the Vikings were undoubtedly resilient and resourceful, it was not just their physical strength that allowed them to survive these winters. It was their mental fortitude, their ability to endure and even thrive in the face of overwhelming adversity. The mental challenges of winter in the Viking world were as real and formidable as the cold itself, and the ways in which the Vikings stayed psychologically strong offer profound insight into the human capacity for resilience. The most immediate psychological effect of winter was the sheer isolation. During the long, dark months, the days seemed to stretch endlessly, with the sun barely rising above the horizon and the nights lasting for what felt like eternity. In the heart of Scandinavia, the further one ventured north, the less daylight one could expect. In the extreme north, during the darkest part of winter, the sun would not rise for days, and the world would be shrouded in an almost oppressive darkness. For the Vikings, this was not just an inconvenience, it was a genuine psychological challenge. The lack of sunlight could lead to feelings of despair, a deep sense of isolation, and even seasonal depression, a condition that we now recognize as seasonal affective disorder, SAD. The lack of natural light, combined with the relentless cold, created a sense of confinement, a feeling of being trapped in a harsh, unchanging world. Yet the Vikings, like many ancient cultures, had developed ways to combat this isolation. One of the most important strategies they used was to maintain close-knit, communal living arrangements. The Viking longhouse, with its central hearth and shared spaces, became not just a physical structure but a psychological refuge from the isolation of winter. The longhouse provided warmth, both literal and emotional, where families and clans could gather together, share food, tell stories, and engage in communal activities that fostered a sense of connection. These social interactions were not just important for physical survival, they were essential for mental well-being. By staying close to one another, the Vikings could combat the loneliness and desolation that might otherwise take root during the long winter nights. The central hearth, the heart of every longhouse, was more than just a source of warmth. It was the focal point of social life, a gathering place where the community could come together, share meals, and engage in rituals that helped maintain morale. The fire itself became a symbol of hope and life, a beacon of light in the darkness. The warmth of the hearth and the human connection it fostered helped to counter the psychological effects of the cold and isolation. In many ways, the hearth was a symbol of the Viking spirit, a source of comfort and security in a world that could often seem inhospitable and unforgiving. Another important aspect of Viking resilience was their deep connection to their cultural and spiritual beliefs. The Vikings had a rich and complex mythology, one that offered not just an explanation of the world around them but also a framework for understanding and enduring hardship. The gods and goddesses of Viking mythology were often portrayed as powerful, yet human-like figures who faced challenges and struggles, much like the Vikings themselves. Odin, the chief god, was associated with wisdom and sacrifice, having given up one of his eyes in exchange for knowledge. Thor, the thunder god, was a symbol of strength and endurance, battling the forces of chaos and destruction. These gods were not distant, untouchable beings. They were figures who embodied the virtues that the Vikings aspired to: courage, perseverance, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. In times of hardship, the Vikings would turn to their mythology for comfort and guidance. The belief in the gods provided a sense of purpose and meaning, even in the darkest of times.